The sparks before the storm. Imagine a world lit only by fire. Streets drowned in shadows, nights ruled by silence, and the rhythm of life bound to the rising and setting of the sun. No engines, no factories, no humming of machines, only the crackle of wood in a hearth and the creak of wagons pulled by weary horses. This was the world before the storm, a world on the edge of an unimaginable transformation. But hidden in the smoke of coal mines, in the whispers of inventors, and in the restless ambition of nations, something was stirring. A change was coming, fierce, unstoppable, and as powerful as a thunderclap. The Industrial Revolution was not just an age of progress. It was an earthquake that would shake every corner of the globe. Yet revolutions never begin in silence. They start with sparks, small, fragile, dangerous. In the towns of Britain, sparks leapt from blacksmiths' anvils, from the minds of daring dreamers, and from the coal pits that clawed at the earth's belly. Each spark threatened to ignite a fire that would consume the old world and forge a new one. Britain was the first to burn. Its soil was soaked with coal, its rivers ready to turn water wheels, and its merchants hungry for wealth. But power does not awaken without resistance. The world that had existed for centuries, the lords, the peasants, the farmers bound to fields, was not about to vanish quietly. The question was, who would shape the future, and who would be left behind in the ashes? In smoky taverns, whispers of new machines spread like rumors of a coming storm. Machines that could spin thread faster than 100 hands. Engines that could turn wheels without horses. Iron that could bend, break, and be reborn stronger than stone. For some, these were promises of riches. For others, they were omens of ruin. The suspense was unbearable. What if these machines destroyed the dignity of handcrafts? What if they stripped the farmer of his land, the weaver of her loom, the blacksmith of his hammer? Change is never gentle. It claws, it tears, it demands a price. And yet to ignore it was to fall behind forever. Across the Atlantic, America was watching. A young nation, wild with ambition, hungering to rise. It saw Britain's smoke and fire, and felt its pulse quicken. Could this revolution be borrowed, stolen, or reforged in the New World? Or would it consume America before it could master its flames? This was not a tale of inventions alone. It was a war of ideas. Tradition against innovation. Land against factory. Silence against thunder. The very definition of freedom was at stake. Would freedom mean clinging to the past, or daring to chase a future no one could yet imagine? In crowded cities, workers gasped at the sight of machines roaring to life, their iron jaws devouring raw materials, spitting out fabrics, metals, and steam. The air grew thick with smoke, the streets with bodies, the nights with fear and wonder alike. People asked themselves in hushed voices, is this progress or a curse? And then came the inventions that would change everything. James Watt's steam engine. Richard Arkwright's spinning frame. Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Each invention was a hammer blow against the old world, each a signal that nothing, no king, no empire, no farmer's field, would ever remain the same. But with every victory came new dangers. Children sent into factories where daylight never reached. Miners trapped in pits of darkness, lungs blackened by coal. Families torn apart, by relentless hours of labor. The price of progress was written in sweat, blood, and broken bones. And still, no one could stop it. The revolution rolled forward like a storm, swallowing nations in its path. It carried both hope and horror, wealth and poverty, triumph and tragedy. To resist was to drown. To embrace it was to risk losing one's soul. Britain's empire grew fat on its machines, its ships carrying cotton, iron, and coal across the seas. America followed, first learning, then rivaling, then surpassing. Two nations, bound by industry yet divided by ambition, would soon stand on the world stage as titans. But titans cast long shadows, because what no one yet realized was this: the revolution was not confined to factories and fields. It would invade politics, society, even war itself. It would challenge kings and empires, empower new classes, and spark movements that demanded rights never before imagined. What began as a hum of machines would become a roar that shook governments. Workers would rise against masters. Slaves in America would see in machines both their bondage and their possible salvation. Women, once silenced, would march into factories and demand their place in history. Every twist of iron, every hiss of steam carried consequences. Some saw miracles, others saw monsters. And as the world raced into this new age, it carried a question as sharp as any blade. Was mankind building its greatest triumph or its ultimate downfall? This is the story of how Britain and America lit the fire that changed the world. A fire that burned brighter, hotter, and more dangerously than any before. A fire that forged modern civilization and left scars that still bleed today. But beware, the fire was never easily controlled. It spread faster than its masters, and its embers still smolder in every machine, every city, every nation today. And in the chapters to come, you will see how that fire nearly consumed the very hands that created it, and why the final twist in this tale will leave you stunned. Engines of fire and steam. The moment the first piston thundered into motion, the world felt the tremor. A machine no bigger than a cottage had unleashed a power greater than 100 horses. It breathed steam, hissed like a beast, and roared with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. People gathered in awe, their faces lit by firelight, wondering if this invention was a miracle or the awakening of something monstrous. James Watt, a man of restless genius, had unlocked the secret of steam. He did not invent the engine, but he perfected it, gave it breath and muscle, made it strong enough to move more than wheels. He made it move history itself. Yet with every improvement came whispers. Had Watt given mankind a servant, or had he unleashed a master? Factories rose around these engines like shrines to a new god. Inside, gears clattered, belts spun, wheels churned endlessly. The sound was deafening, but to investors it was music, the song of profit. To workers, it was a drumbeat of endless toil. The engine did not sleep, so neither could they. Coal became the black heart of the revolution. It was dug in dangerous mines, hauled by children too small to stand straight, burned in furnaces that turned night into day. Every puff of smoke was a sign of progress, but also a warning. The earth itself was being devoured. The suspense deepened in the countryside. Farmers whose families had tilled soil for generations suddenly found their world shrinking. Machines could spin, weave, and grind faster than human hands. Land once sacred was fenced, enclosed, taken by the wealthy to feed the growing hunger of cities. The village quiet was replaced by the clang of factories. And still, the steam engine grew stronger. It leapt from factories to locomotives, pulling iron beasts across landscapes at terrifying speed. People gasped as they rode for the first time, watching trees blur past, feeling the ground tremble. To some, it felt like flying. To others, it felt like racing toward doom. The iron rails stitched Britain together. Towns that had once seemed days apart were now hours away. Coal moved, cotton moved, people moved. The world shrank, and with it, old certainties collapsed. If time itself could be conquered, what else was left to question? Steam also ruled the seas. Great ships belched smoke as they plowed across oceans, no longer slaves to the wind. Britain's navy, once proud of its sails, now bowed to the power of coal and steel. Trade grew faster, empires stretched farther, and the race for dominance quickened. But every machine carried a hidden cost. Accidents were frequent. Boilers exploded without warning, ripping apart factories and ships alike. Workers were crushed in gears, mangled by belts, burned by fire. Steam gave life to progress, but it could just as easily deal death. Still, ambition drowned out fear. Investors saw fortunes. Kings saw power. Nations saw destiny. And for every broken worker, 10 more desperate souls stood ready to take their place. The machine's hunger was insatiable, and so was humanity's thirst for what it promised. Children were among the first victims and the first sacrifices. Tiny hands that could reach between threads were prized by factory owners. They worked in darkness, in filth, for hours that stretched beyond exhaustion. For them, the machine was not progress. It was a prison with iron teeth. Yet even as suffering spread, hope lingered. Some saw in these engines the possibility of a better future. Faster travel, cheaper goods, more wealth. For visionaries, this was the dawn of a new age, an age where mankind would no longer be chained to nature, but would command it. But hope and fear are never far apart. As the steam engine spread, so too did rebellion. In hushed meetings, men cursed the machines that had stolen their livelihoods. They swore vengeance against factories that had reduced them to beggars. Something violent was coming. The Luddites struck first. Under cover of night, they stormed into factories, hammers raised, smashing the machines to pieces. Sparks flew, gears shattered, owners fled. But the machines were rebuilt, stronger than before. No matter how many they destroyed, more kept coming. The clash between man and machine had begun. And though the Luddites fought with fury, history would not turn back. The machine was relentless, and the tide of progress was too powerful to resist. Every act of rebellion only fed the suspense. What price would humanity ultimately pay for this revolution? As Britain burned with change, America's eyes gleamed with hunger. Across the ocean, whispers spread of fortunes waiting in cotton fields, iron mines, and endless land. If Britain had lit the fire, America would pour on the oil. A transatlantic rivalry was being born, one that would decide the fate of the modern world. But before America could rise, it would face its own demons, slavery, division, and the question of whether machines would free men or chain them more tightly. The stage was set for conflict as fierce as any battlefield. Every hiss of steam, every clatter of gears carried with it the tension of a story not yet finished. The engine had been unleashed, but its direction was unknown. Would it drive mankind to prosperity or drag it into ruin? What no one yet understood was that steam was only the beginning. Greater forces still waited in the shadows: electricity, steel, oil, each ready to ignite another chapter of transformation, each capable of reshaping the world in ways no one dared to imagine. And as Britain surged ahead, America prepared to leap. The race for supremacy was not just about machines. It was about destiny itself. The suspense of what was coming next would not only define two nations, but set the course for the entire world. The cities of smoke. As the machines grew, so did the cities. Once quiet towns exploded into sprawling industrial jungles, their skylines pierced by chimneys that vomited black smoke into the heavens. Daylight dimmed under the haze, and night never truly came, for the furnaces burned endlessly. The city had become a creature of fire and steel, alive and hungry. People flooded into these cities like rivers breaking their banks. Farmers abandoned fields. Villagers left behind traditions centuries old. They came chasing hope, clutching dreams of steady wages and full bellies. But what awaited them was not a paradise. It was a battlefield of survival. The streets were narrow, filthy, and choked with life. Tenements rose like prisons, stacked with families crammed into single rooms. Water was scarce, clean air rarer still. Disease spread faster than news, and death became a neighbor that visited too often. Yet still, more arrived each day, drawn by the machine's promise. Factories loomed at the heart of these cities, vast cathedrals of iron, where workers worshipped not gods, but gears. The factory bell replaced the church bell. Its toll demanded obedience. Its rhythm controlled every hour. The worker's life no longer belonged to the sun. It belonged to the machine. Inside, the air was thick with lint, smoke, and sweat. The roar of machines drowned out human voices. The clang of iron silenced song. Fingers bled, backs broke, lungs choked. Yet the wheels never stopped. To falter was to be cast aside, replaced in an instant by another desperate soul. Children scurried beneath machines, their tiny bodies perfect for spaces too dangerous for grown men. Women worked until exhaustion bent their spines. Men, once proud craftsmen, now stood as mere attendants to the endless hunger of machines. The city demanded sacrifice, and it consumed without pity. And yet, amid the misery, there was a strange kind of wonder. Goods that once belonged only to the wealthy, cloth, glass, iron tools, flowed into markets. Prices fell, availability grew, and a new kind of consumer was born. For the first time, ordinary people could touch the luxuries of kings. But this blessing was double-edged. The very abundance that filled homes also filled pockets of factory lords. A new aristocracy of industry rose, their wealth built on the bent backs of workers. They flaunted their riches in mansions far from the smoke, while those who earned it lived and died in the shadows. Tension coiled tighter. Whispers of injustice spread in crowded taverns. Workers, exhausted and embittered, began to see the truth. The revolution had not freed them. It had chained them in new ways. And chains, no matter how invisible, always invite rebellion. The first strikes erupted. Workers demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, fairer pay. Factory owners resisted, hiring guards, calling in soldiers, crushing dissent with iron fists. But every strike, though broken, left embers smoldering. A storm was brewing, one as dangerous as any machine. Across the Atlantic, American cities too began to choke on smoke. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, streets filled with wagons, ships, and factories. America was younger, rawer, but hungrier. Its cities grew with explosive speed, each one a furnace where dreams and nightmares burned together. Immigrants poured into these cities, bringing with them languages, cultures, and labor. They built railroads, dug canals, manned machines. To them, America promised opportunity. But the factories that awaited them demanded the same sacrifice as Britain's: long hours, broken health, lives spent in service of progress. And yet, America's cities pulsed with a different kind of energy. Where Britons were weighed down by centuries of hierarchy, America's carried the wild hope of the frontier. The belief lingered, dangerous, intoxicating, that here, anyone could rise, even from the factory floor. Still, the costs could not be ignored. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods, fueled by overcrowding and wooden structures. Cholera swept through water supplies. Crime festered in alleys where poverty ruled. The industrial city was both a marvel and a monster, a place where fortunes were made and countless lives destroyed. The suspense deepened with each passing year. Could these cities survive their own hunger? Could society bear the weight of such extremes? Mansions beside slums, wealth beside ruin, hope beside despair? The pressure was unbearable, and cracks were beginning to show. Writers and thinkers began to speak out. Charles Dickens painted portraits of misery that shook Britain's conscience. Reformers in America demanded cleaner water, safer housing, limits on child labor. The industrial city had given the world wonders, but it had also revealed its darkest face. Still, the machine did not pause. Its momentum was too great. Every protest, every reform, every cry for help was like a stone thrown into a raging river. The current of progress swept everything forward, dragging humanity toward a future no one could fully see. And hidden within this chaos was a secret force, an invisible power that would soon electrify the world in ways more shocking than steam. In laboratories, in quiet experiments, men were taming lightning itself, preparing to unleash an energy far greater than coal. But before electricity could light the darkness, the clash between workers and masters had to reach its breaking point. The industrial city was not only a place of invention, it was a powder keg, and sparks were everywhere. The suspense was unbearable. Would the revolution create a brighter tomorrow, or tear nations apart in fire and fury? One thing was certain: the world could never return to silence. The age of smoke had arrived, and it was only the beginning. Rebellion and resistance, no revolution ever arrives without enemies. For every machine that promised progress, there was a man who cursed it, a woman who feared it, a child who suffered under its weight. Beneath the smoke and profit of the Industrial Revolution, a storm of anger was forming, one that would not be silenced. The first sparks came from the weavers. Their looms, once symbols of pride and craft, had been replaced by monstrous frames powered by water and steam. Hands that had once spun beauty were reduced to feeding machines. Rage burned hotter than coal. The weavers felt betrayed. Their skill turned to dust overnight. And so, under cover of darkness, they struck. In barns and taverns, secret oaths were sworn. Hammers were gathered, torches lit, and bands of men moved like shadows toward the factories. Their targets were not fellow workers, nor kings, nor lords. It was the machines themselves, cold and unfeeling, that bore the brunt of their fury. With a crash of iron and a blaze of fire, the Luddites declared their war. Wooden frames splintered, gears shattered, sparks flew. Factory owners awoke to find their fortunes in ruins. The rebellion was not just destruction, it was a message. We will not be replaced. But the masters of industry were ruthless. Soldiers were dispatched, rifles loaded, sabers drawn. The Luddites were hunted, hanged, exiled. Their resistance was drowned in blood. The machines they destroyed were rebuilt, stronger and more efficient. Progress did not pause for rebels. And yet, rebellion did not die. In the shadows of the city, workers whispered of rights, of dignity, of a world where the machine served man, not the other way around. What had begun as destruction would soon evolve into something more dangerous: organization. In Britain, the Chartists rose. They demanded votes for workers, fair representation, a voice in the halls of power long denied to them. Their rallies filled streets. Their petitions carried thousands of signatures. They believed the revolution should not only reshape industry, it should reshape society. The masters trembled at the thought. If workers gained power, would profits collapse? Would the system itself crumble? Factories might be rebuilt, but ideas, once unleashed, could not be caged so easily. The Chartists had lit a fuse that no army could extinguish. In America, resistance took a different shape. There, the shadow of slavery loomed over every invention, every factory, every cotton field. Machines like Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton king, but also deepened the chains of those forced to picket. Resistance came not from breaking machines, but from breaking bondage. Enslaved men and women whispered songs of freedom as they worked, their voices carrying secrets of escape, rebellion, and survival. Each lash of the whip was answered with a promise. Someday, these chains will break. The Industrial Revolution did not weaken slavery. It sharpened it into the most explosive question America had ever faced. The suspense thickened. Could a nation that preached liberty continue to build its wealth on slavery? Could a revolution of machines coexist with a society chained in human bondage? The contradiction tore at America's soul, and the answer would come in blood. Back in Britain, strikes grew bolder. Men and women walked out of factories, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, fair wages. They faced hunger, blacklisting, and the ever-present threat of soldiers. Yet the strikes kept coming, each one louder than the last. Factory owners called them ungrateful, criminals, enemies of progress. But the workers called themselves something else: brothers, sisters, allies. For the first time, they realized they were not powerless individuals. They were a force, bound together by shared suffering and shared hope. Unions began to form, fragile and illegal at first, but unbreakable in spirit. They met in secret, planned in whispers, and dreamed of a future where the machine worked for man, not against him. The fight was no longer just survival, it was for justice. But the cost was high. Strikers were beaten, imprisoned, starved. Families went hungry, children sickened, hope dimmed. The masters wielded their wealth like weapons, and governments bent to their will. It seemed for every step forward, workers were forced 2 steps back. And still, they endured, because within their struggle lay something greater than themselves. They were not just fighting for bread, but for dignity. Not just for wages, but for the right to be seen as human in a world that threatened to turn them into cogs. The suspense only grew sharper. Who would triumph, the iron will of the masters or the unbreakable spirit of the workers? Could justice survive in a world built on profit? The clash was not just about machines, but about the soul of civilization itself. And all the while, America's conflict grew closer. Cotton fed the mills of Britain. Slavery fed the cotton. The Atlantic trembled under this connection, a bond soaked in wealth and blood. Both nations were locked together, their fates bound by the very revolution they had unleashed. Soon, rebellion would no longer be confined to factories or fields. It would spread to parliaments, to congresses, to battlefields. The Industrial Revolution was not only changing how men worked, it was changing what men demanded, what they fought for, and what they would die for. The world was hurtling toward confrontation. Britain's workers, America's slaves, the masters of industry, and the kings of empire, all were caught in the gears of a revolution too powerful to stop. The suspense was unbearable, for everyone knew the truth. The greatest battles of the Industrial Revolution had not yet begun. Empire and expansion smoke did not stay trapped in cities. It drifted across seas, carried by ships that now raced with steam instead of sails. Britain, already a mighty empire, saw in its machines the chance to rule not only at home, but across the globe. Factories needed cotton, iron, and markets. The empire would provide all three. Every colony became a gear in the imperial machine. India fed Britain's textile mills with cotton. Africa provided resources wrestled from its soil. Sugar, tobacco, and tea poured in from the Caribbean. Ships returned loaded with goods made in Manchester and Birmingham, cloth, iron, tools, sold back to the world at a profit. The revolution was not just industrial, it was imperial. Britain's factories turned colonies into workshops without walls, their people laborers without choice. Railways sliced across India, not for the benefit of locals, but to feed the hunger of distant factories. But empire was not a gentle hand. Where resources were taken, cultures were broken. Where railways were laid, traditions were uprooted. The machine demanded fuel, and the empire delivered it, no matter the cost to the people who lived beneath its shadow. And yet, the empire's grip gave Britain power no nation had ever known. Goods moved faster, armies moved farther, communication quickened with every invention. For Britain, the Industrial Revolution was not merely wealth, it was control. It was dominance wrapped in smoke and steel. America, though young, watched with restless eyes. It had no vast empire, yet, but it had land, raw and endless. It had rivers to turn wheels, forests to fell, fields to plow. The frontier was America's empire, and industry would devour it mile by mile. The telegraph crackled across the continent. Railroads pierced wilderness, cities sprouted like iron weeds. America's expansion was not across oceans, but across its own heartland. Each new line of rail, each new factory, each new town carried the same rhythm of progress: faster, louder, unstoppable. But like Britain, America's expansion was stained with conflict. Native lands were seized, their people displaced or destroyed. The dream of manifest destiny marched side by side with industry, crushing anything that stood in its path. The suspense grew sharper. Could any nation stand against such forces? Europe trembled, watching Britain's empire expand, watching America rise. Germany, France, Russia, they too raced to catch up, desperate not to be left behind in the furnace of progress. And with this race came rivalry. Industry was no longer about invention alone, it was about power. The nation with the fastest railways, the strongest factories, the most efficient machines would hold the keys to dominance. Competition was fierce, and the world was the prize. Factories became arsenals as much as workshops. Iron that once built bridges now forged cannons. Steam that once drove mills now powered warships. The line between commerce and conflict blurred as every nation prepared to defend its progress or seize another's. Britain's empire seemed unshakable, its navy invincible, its factories unmatched. But history whispers a cruel truth: no empire lasts forever. Beneath the glory of Britain's industrial might, cracks were already forming, cracks that would widen in the centuries to come. America's expansion, too, carried danger. Its cotton wealth tied it to slavery. Its frontier expansion fueled endless conflict. Its rapid growth made it both admired and feared. Like Britain, it had unlocked the power of machines, but had it unleashed something even it could not control? Meanwhile, in the colonies, resistance smoldered. In India, protests erupted. In Africa, uprisings began. The empire's subjects saw the truth: they were not partners in progress, but prisoners of it. For every railway laid, resentment deepened. For every factory's wealth, there was a land stripped bare. The suspense was unbearable. Could the machine that built empires also be the force that destroyed them? Would Britain's iron grip tighten until it shattered? Would America's hunger for land consume its soul? The revolution's fire burned bright, but fire can spread out of control. Yet for all its dangers, empire gave industry its fuel. Cotton kept Britain's looms turning. Coal kept its furnaces blazing. Gold, sugar, and tea lined the pockets of its merchants. Without empire, the machine would have starved. And so, the cycle deepened. Empire fed industry. Industry fed empire. Each turn of the wheel made Britain richer, America stronger, and the world more entangled in their rivalry. The suspense was no longer whether industry would dominate, but who would dominate through industry. For ordinary people, the question was simpler. Could they endure? Could they survive? For them, empire and industry were distant giants whose battles crushed lives beneath their feet. Yet even they sensed that history was moving faster than ever, and that they were caught inside it. The Industrial Revolution had begun as a spark, then a storm. Now it had become an empire of smoke, a global struggle for power unlike anything seen before. And still, more change was coming, change so vast it would leave even kings trembling. Because in the distance, new revolutions were stirring, not of steam or coal, but of electricity, steel, and oil. The empire of smoke was only the beginning. What came next would be brighter, deadlier, and more unstoppable than anything the world had ever seen. The age of steel and lightning, the world of coal and steam, was only the beginning. Beneath the soot-stained sky, a new force was stirring, bright, invisible, and far more dangerous than fire. Men had begun to trap lightning itself, bending it to their will. The age of electricity was dawning, and with it, the world would never know darkness again. Factories glowed with electric light. Streets once choked in shadow burned bright through the night. The hum of dynamos joined the roar of engines, as machines powered by lightning ran faster and longer than steam could ever dream. The city no longer slept, and mankind stood in awe of its own brilliance. Steel rose with the lightning. Stronger than iron, flexible yet unbreakable, it became the skeleton of a new world. Bridges stretched across mighty rivers. Railways carried trains across continents, and cities grew not wider, but taller, scraping at the very sky. The skyline became a battlefield of ambition. In New York, Chicago, London, towers of glass and steel clawed higher each year. The city was no longer bound to the earth. It rose above it, defying gravity, defying nature itself. Progress had found a new language, vertical. But steel was not just for buildings. It was for weapons. Cannons, rifles, warships. Every piece of steel forged carried within it both the promise of protection and the threat of destruction. Industry was no longer simply about wealth. It was about power, sharpened into blades and bullets. The suspense grew as rival inventors raced to control the future. In America, Thomas Edison battled with Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse. Their war of currents was more than science. It was a duel for dominance, fought with ideas, electricity, and ambition. Edison lit cities with his direct current, but Tesla envisioned something greater. Alternating current that could travel miles, bringing power to every home, every farm, every factory. It was genius against genius, lightning against lightning, and the world held its breath to see who would win. Meanwhile, steel and electricity reshaped work. Factories grew larger, faster, deadlier. Machines, once powered by steam, now moved with a precision that left human hands in the dust. Work was quicker, but also harsher. The machine's demand for obedience was greater than ever. Cities blazed with electric light, yet in their alleys, the poor still stumbled in darkness. Progress illuminated palaces and factories, but tenements remained suffocated in filth. The contrast grew starker. The rich touched lightning, while the poor still battled shadows. Yet even in poverty, awe remained. For the first time, an ordinary man could ride an electric tram, see a city sparkle like daylight at midnight, hear a voice carried through wires, or watch moving pictures flicker in the dark. The impossible was becoming ordinary, and it felt like magic. But magic has a price. Power plants roared, rivers were dammed, coal burned hotter than ever. The machine's hunger did not fade with electricity, it grew. Humanity had built a new god of light, but it still demanded sacrifice. Steel railways now stretched across nations, binding them in iron. America's transcontinental railroad linked oceans. Russia's Trans-Siberian Railway cut across frozen wilderness. The world was shrinking, pulled tighter by steel tracks and humming wires. Distance itself was no longer a barrier. And yet, with every bridge and railway, new rivalries formed. Nations eyed one another with suspicion. If railways could carry trade, they could also carry armies. If steel built cities, it could also build battleships. Progress and danger marched hand in hand. Britain still stood as the world's giant, but now challengers emerged. America's factories roared louder each year. Germany rose with speed and precision. Even Japan, once isolated, leapt into the industrial race with a hunger that startled the West. The balance of power was shifting, and suspense gripped the world stage. For workers, the struggle deepened. Factories no longer needed skill, only endurance. Men became extensions of machines. Women bent under endless hours. Children still labored, their hands blistered by machines sharper, faster, deadlier than before. Progress promised light, but many still lived in shadow. Reformers shouted louder. They demanded education for children, limits on hours, protections for laborers. In some nations, their voices were heard. In others, they were silenced. The clash between profit and people had only grown sharper in this new age of steel and lightning. The suspense stretched thinner. Was the machine creating freedom or forging stronger chains? Electricity promised to free men from drudgery, yet factories bound them tighter than ever. Steel promised to build wonders, yet also forged weapons for wars not yet fought. And still, the inventions kept coming. The telephone carried voices across miles. The phonograph captured sound itself. The light bulb banished darkness. Each invention seemed a miracle, and yet behind every miracle lurked a question. How long before it turned into a curse? The age of steel and lightning dazzled the world, but it also frightened it. People marveled at their new powers, but deep inside, they asked, had mankind reached too far? Was this the beginning of a golden age, or the opening act of a tragedy? Because soon, these inventions, these miracles of industry, would be turned to darker purposes. Nations, armed with steel, lightning, and ambition, were marching toward a future drenched not in light, but in fire. The world was racing toward war, and no one could stop it. Machines of war industry had promised prosperity, but in the hands of nations, it became something else, an arsenal. The same furnaces that forged steel bridges now poured out cannons. The same factories that wove cloth now produced uniforms. The machine that built cities was about to tear them apart. The Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, all bore the mark of industry. Rifles fired faster, cannons struck farther, railways delivered armies with terrifying speed. War was no longer the clash of men alone. It was the clash of machines. In America, the Civil War revealed this new face of conflict. Railroads carried troops across vast distances. Telegraphs delivered orders in minutes. Factories churned out rifles by the thousands. For the first time, industry itself decided the outcome of war. The suspense thickened as ironclad ships slid into the water, their steel armor shrugging off cannon fire. Wooden fleets, once masters of the sea, suddenly seemed fragile as kindling. War at sea had changed forever, and nations scrambled to keep pace. And beneath it all, the machine's hunger was relentless. Wars demanded coal, steel, oil, and more. Mines worked night and day. Factories blazed without rest. Workers bled in both fields and furnaces. Industry fed war, and war fed industry. in a cycle that grew darker with every battle. The Franco-Prussian War revealed the terrifying precision of modern weapons. Breech-loading rifles cut down soldiers by the thousands. Artillery bombarded cities into rubble. The old rules of honor and cavalry charges vanished in the smoke. War was now an industrial slaughter. And yet, the world barely had time to recoil before preparing for more. Nations built stockpiles of weapons, expanded rail networks, and sharpened their armies. The suspense was unbearable. Everyone knew another war was coming, but no one knew when or how devastating it would be. Britain clung to its empire, strengthening its navy with steel warships that dwarfed anything seen before. Germany rose with terrifying speed, its factories roaring, its armies drilling with machine-like discipline. America, divided but rising, prepared to test its new power on the world stage. The colonies, too, felt the weight of industrial war. Soldiers from India, Africa, and beyond were dragged into battles far from home, armed with rifles that could shatter traditions older than empires. For them, industry was not progress, it was conquest. The suspense grew sharper with each invention. The machine gun, capable of mowing down lines of men in seconds. Explosives deadlier than ever before. War was no longer about courage. It was about who commanded the deadliest machines. But these machines were not confined to battlefields. The same technology that killed could also build. Telegraph lines, railways, and ships expanded faster than ever. Progress and destruction were twins, born of the same furnaces, racing side by side toward an uncertain future. And then, the invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel revealed the paradox of industry. Created to help miners, it became a weapon of terrible power. Industry's miracles and curses could no longer be separated. Every discovery carried both promise and peril. By the late 19th century, the world stood armed to the teeth. Every nation prepared as though war was inevitable, stockpiling weapons, building alliances, whispering threats. The machine had given them power, and with power came fear. The suspense was unbearable. Would these machines bring peace through deterrence or destruction through arrogance? Could nations resist the temptation to test their new weapons? Could the world survive if they did not? In America, the Civil War had already shown the devastating cost: more than 600,000 dead, countless more wounded. The lesson was clear, yet the hunger for power drowned out the warning. Other nations saw not tragedy, but opportunity. The battlefield had become a laboratory, and soldiers were experiments. Every war tested new weapons, new strategies, new ways of killing. And every war taught nations how to prepare for the next, bigger, faster, deadlier. Meanwhile, workers who built these weapons wondered at their role. They labored in factories that fed war, often without choice, often without reward. Their sweat turned into steel, their steel into rifles, their rifles into rivers of blood. The machine demanded sacrifice not only from soldiers, but from everyone. The suspense reached its breaking point as the 20th century loomed. The world was armed, the machines were ready, and the rivalries between nations grew hotter each day. It was not a question of if war would come, but when. And when it did, it would not be like any war before. For the first time in history, nations would hurl their entire industrial might against one another. Factories would become as important as battlefields. civilians would suffer as much as soldiers. The machine was ready to turn the world itself into a battlefield. The world stood on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss. The Industrial Revolution had given mankind unmatched power. The only question left was whether that power would build a brighter tomorrow or plunge humanity into fire. The suspense was unbearable, for the first great industrial war was coming, and nothing could stop it. The first global inferno, it began with a gunshot in Sarajevo, but it did not end there. The bullet that struck an archduke was merely the spark. Behind it stood empires armed with steel, powered by coal, driven by machines that had turned war into something unrecognizable. The world was about to step into its first truly industrial inferno. When the armies marched in 1914, they carried not just rifles and cannons, they carried the full weight of the Industrial Revolution. Factories roared to life, spewing out millions of bullets, thousands of shells, endless uniforms, helmets, and weapons. The war would not be fought by soldiers alone. It would be fought by machines, supplied by nations whose factories became their lifeblood. Railways turned nations into giants with iron legs, carrying troops and supplies at terrifying speed. Telegraph wires carried orders across continents in moments. The machine had become the nervous system of war, and it pulsed with deadly efficiency. The suspense turned to horror on the battlefields of Europe. Trench lines scarred the earth, stretching for miles. Men huddled in mud, waiting as artillery thundered day and night. Shells rained down with mechanical precision, ripping apart everything they touched. The battlefield had become a factory of death. And then came the machine gun. Its rattle was the sound of the new age. Endless bullets spraying faster than any man could reload. Whole waves of soldiers were cut down in seconds, their bravery swallowed by the cold efficiency of steel. Courage meant nothing against a weapon that turned men into shadows. Gas drifted across the trenches, chlorine, mustard, phosgene. Invisible, silent, merciless. It burned lungs, blinded eyes, melted flesh. Science had created miracles of medicine and light, but here it birthed new horrors. The Industrial Revolution had given mankind the tools not just to kill, but to torture the very breath of life. Above the trenches, another terror appeared. Airplanes. Once fragile inventions of daring pioneers, they became machines of war, dropping bombs, spying from the skies, turning the heavens into yet another battlefield. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, now roared with death. On the seas, steel monsters clashed. Dreadnought battleships, vast and bristling with guns, pounded one another with industrial fury. Submarines lurked beneath the waves, striking unseen, dragging merchant ships into watery graves. Even the oceans were no longer safe. And yet, the war was not confined to battlefields. Civilians starved as blockades cut off food. Cities shook with artillery. Factories worked day and night, their workers as much soldiers as those in the trenches. The Industrial Revolution had blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Now, everyone was part of the war machine. The suspense deepened as America watched. At first, it stood apart, its factories supplying goods, but its soldiers kept home. But as German submarines sank ships and alliances grew, America stepped into the inferno. Its entry brought fresh factories, fresh soldiers, and fresh power. With America's might, the balance shifted. Fresh troops surged into Europe, carried by ships built by factories, armed with weapons made by machines, supplied by an economy roaring with industrial strength. The war that had drained Europe was suddenly reignited with new energy. But victory came at an unspeakable price. Millions lay dead. Millions more wounded, broken, haunted. Entire landscapes were ruined, forests blasted to splinters, villages erased, cities reduced to rubble. The machine had shown its true power, and it had drenched the world in blood. And yet, even in the ashes, the machine kept moving. Factories that had once built weapons turned back to goods. Soldiers returned home to find a world forever changed. Women had filled factories in their absence. New technologies had reshaped daily life, and the old world of kings and empires had crumbled. Germany's empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary vanished. The Ottoman Empire fell. Britain and France emerged scarred, but still standing. And America, young, ambitious, and powerful, stood taller than ever before. The Industrial Revolution had crowned a new contender on the global stage. The suspense shifted. What would be done with this power? Would the nations learn from the horror, or would they sharpen their machines once again? The League of Nations was born, promising peace, but peace built on smoke is fragile. For workers, the war had been both a curse and a catalyst. They had suffered, bled, and died, but they had also proven their worth. Women had marched into factories, demanding equality. Soldiers returned demanding jobs, rights, and recognition. The Industrial Revolution had changed not only nations, but people's demands for justice. Technology, too, refused to rest. Tanks that had rolled across battlefields would soon be perfected. Airplanes that had dropped bombs would become faster, stronger, deadlier. Radios, once used for war, would soon shape culture, politics, and daily life. The machine had tasted war, and it was not finished. The suspense thickened once more. Was this war the end of the inferno, or only its beginning? The machines were still hungry. Nations still armed themselves. Factories still churned out steel and smoke. The fire had been banked, but not extinguished. In the ruins of Europe, amid broken empires and grieving families, one truth was clear. The Industrial Revolution had forever changed war. No longer noble, no longer romantic, it was now mechanical, relentless, and total. War had become industry. And the world, trembling in the silence after the guns, feared what would come next. For if machines had brought such devastation once, what horrors would they unleash when war returned again? The suspense was unbearable, for the shadows of the next inferno were already forming. The second global inferno, the silence after the Great War, was short-lived. Factories hummed again, not with peace but with preparation. The promises of never again faded as nations sharpened their machines, rebuilt their armies, and waited. The Industrial Revolution had not ended war, it had only given it deadlier tools. When war returned in 1939, it came with a fury unmatched in history. This was not a war of cavalry and rifles. It was a war of tanks, planes, submarines, and bombs. Nations had learned the lessons of the last inferno, and they came armed with the full power of modern industry. Germany rose first, its factories roaring back to life under Hitler's command. Tanks rolled across Europe with terrifying speed, fueled by steel and oil. The Blitzkrieg was not just a strategy, it was the perfection of industrial war. Fast, precise, relentless. Britain reeled under the storm. Cities burned as German bombers darkened the skies. But the same industry that had built factories now built Spitfires and Hurricanes. Women and men worked day and night, forging wings of steel to defend their skies. And then came the Battle of the Atlantic. Submarines prowled the seas, sinking ships with mechanical precision. Factories in America churned out convoys of vessels, but for every ship built, one was lost. The ocean itself had become a graveyard of industry. In the East, the Soviet Union unleashed its own industrial might. Factories uprooted and rebuilt deep in the frozen lands turned out tanks by the thousands. Steel poured onto the battlefields of Stalingrad and Kursk, where the clash of machines shook the earth like thunder. America, once again, became the arsenal of democracy. Its factories exploded with productivity, ships, planes, guns, uniforms, all rolling off assembly lines at a speed the world had never seen. Ford and General Motors, once builders of cars, now built bombers and tanks by the hour. The suspense was unbearable as skies filled with bombers. Cities like Dresden, Tokyo, and London became targets, their skylines erased by firestorms. Civilians, once far from battle, were now the front lines. The machine had erased the boundary between soldier and citizen forever. New horrors emerged: rockets, guided bombs, jet engines. Each invention was more advanced, more terrifying than the last. Science had become war's deadliest weapon, its laboratories as important as its generals. But the darkest invention of all was still to come. In secret labs, under guard and silence, scientists split the atom. The Industrial Revolution had begun with steam and coal, but now it reached into the heart of the universe itself. The world had built a weapon of unimaginable power. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the machine transformed warfare again. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships, steel decks launching swarms of planes. Islands became factories of death, each battle a storm of steel and fire. At Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima, machines decided the fate of nations. Factories at home mirrored the front lines. Women known as Rosie the Riveters filled America's plants, welding, riveting, and assembling weapons of war. The machine was no longer just in the hands of soldiers, it was in the hands of every worker, every citizen, every family. The suspense deepened as the Allies gained strength. D-Day, 1944. The largest industrial invasion in history. Thousands of ships, planes, and tanks surged onto the beaches of Normandy. It was not only courage that won the day, it was the vast machinery of industry, the coordinated heartbeat of factories across oceans. And then, in 1945, the world witnessed its darkest hour. Over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 atomic bombs fell, their blinding light brighter than 1,000 suns. In an instant, tens of thousands vanished. The Industrial Revolution had reached its ultimate creation, a weapon capable of erasing cities in seconds. The suspense broke into terror. If humanity could wield such power, what future remained? Could the world survive another war when one bomb could destroy it all? The Industrial Revolution had given mankind the ability not only to build, but to annihilate. And yet, even in the ashes, the machine did not rest. Nations rushed to rebuild, to innovate, to arm themselves for a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. Factories shifted from bombs to consumer goods, but the shadow of destruction loomed over every invention. For workers, the war had brought both empowerment and exhaustion. Women had proven their strength in factories, and they would not return quietly to silence. Soldiers returned home with new expectations: better pay, better rights, better lives. The struggle for justice, born in the smoke of factories, now marched into politics and society. Technology, once reserved for war, spilled into daily life. Radar became air travel. Rockets became space exploration. Computers, once built to break codes, became tools of commerce. The same industry that had nearly destroyed the world was now building a new one. But the suspense remained. Would mankind use its machines for creation or destruction? The memory of Hiroshima and Auschwitz, of Dresden and Tokyo, lingered as warnings carved in smoke. The machine had proven both savior and executioner. The second global inferno had ended, but the Industrial Revolution's fire still burned. Its machines had reshaped not only nations, but the very fate of humanity. And now, the world stood at the edge of a new question. Would these machines guide us into a brighter future, or push us into a darkness from which we could never return? The legacy of fire, the guns of the Second World War, fell silent, but the machine did not sleep. Its hum still filled every city, every factory, every street. The Industrial Revolution had changed the world forever, and its echoes still reverberate through the lives we live today. From the ashes of war, skyscrapers rose, built with steel that once forged tanks. Highways stretched across nations, carrying cars born from assembly lines once devoted to jeeps. The very engines of destruction had become the engines of prosperity. Electricity spread like wildfire. Homes glowed with light bulbs. Radios carried voices across oceans. Televisions flickered with images of a new era. The same lightning that had powered weapons now entertained, connected, and informed billions. And then came the computer. Born in secrecy to crack codes and calculate trajectories, it escaped the battlefield and entered the world. From clumsy giants to sleek machines, computers would become the heartbeat of a new revolution, one born from the fire of the old. But with every triumph came a shadow. Factories that once smoked over Britain and America now smoked in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The hunger for industry had not ended, it had only shifted, spreading across the globe like a tide. The suspense deepened. Could the world handle the cost? The same coal that once lit the furnaces of Manchester now choked skies from Beijing to Delhi. The same oil that powered tanks now fueled cars that filled the air with fumes. Progress was no longer only about wealth, it was about survival. And yet, the dream endured. Industry had lifted millions out of poverty, delivered medicines that saved lives, built bridges that spanned continents, and connected humanity in ways unimaginable before. The machine was both a destroyer and a healer. Britain, the birthplace of the revolution, now stood changed, its empire gone, its factories quieter, its skies clearer. America, once the student, now stood as the master, its machines powering not only industry, but culture, technology, and global dominance. The rivalry of nations did not end with war. It shifted into space. Rockets that once carried bombs now carried men to the stars. The Industrial Revolution had begun in coal mines, but now its descendants reached for the heavens. But the suspense sharpened once again. Could mankind wield such power without destroying itself? The nuclear shadow remained, hanging heavy over every invention, every discovery. For the first time in history, humanity held the ability to end itself with the very tools it had created. The workers, once the forgotten cogs, became voices of change. Unions fought for rights. Women demanded equality. Minorities marched for justice. The machine had not only reshaped industry, it had reshaped society, fueling movements that demanded freedom for all. And yet, inequality persisted. The machine gave wealth to some and misery to others. The same story that began in Britain's factories repeated itself across the globe. Riches for a few, hardship for many. The revolution was not finished, it had only grown larger. Today, the hum of industry is everywhere. Cars on highways, planes in the sky, phones in our pockets. Every invention, every comfort, every connection carries the fingerprints of that first spark in Britain's coal mines. The fire still burns, even if we no longer see the smoke. But the fire is hotter now. Climate change, pollution, and resource wars remind us of the price. The machine that gave us power also threatens our future. The suspense is no longer just about war. It is about survival on a planet strained by progress. Yet hope remains. New revolutions rise, digital, green, renewable. Just as steam gave way to steel, and steel gave way to electricity, now wind, sun, and code promise a future less bound to destruction. The story of industry is still being written. And in that story, Britain and America still stand as symbols. Britain, the birthplace of the revolution. America, the inheritor that carried it to global heights. Together, they reshaped the world, for better and for worse. The suspense builds toward us, the living. The question is not what the Industrial Revolution did. It is what we will do with the world it left us. Will we master the machine, or will the machine master us? Every factory, every invention, every new discovery carries echoes of that first spark. It is the whisper of coal in a furnace, the hiss of steam in an engine, the crackle of lightning in a wire. It is the legacy of fire. And as we stand today, surrounded by wonders unimaginable to those who first dug coal from Britain's mines, we must remember, the Industrial Revolution was not only about machines. It was about choices that lifted humanity higher, but also pushed it to the brink. The story ends where it began, with a spark. The Industrial Revolution lit a fire that changed the world forever. Whether that fire guides us into light or burns us into ash, that is the suspenseful question that still hangs over every heartbeat of the modern age.